Hello, and welcome back to the Coding Hub. In today's video, we will have a look at how you should write clean code. Now, as you can see here, I've got a Cloud Shell instance open. This is a Google Cloud piece of software that you can run on any computer on your browser. It's a progressive web app that you can install. But as you can see, it looks very, very similar to Visual Studio Code, and I do actually think it is some sort of flavor of Visual Studio Code with Google's own implementation on top of it. Now, for this video, we will be working with C#. However, the tips that I will give you here for writing clean code should hopefully apply to any object-oriented programming language, and even some other languages that aren't OOP. So let's get started here first. I don't take this code as a definite. It might not compile. This isn't the aim of this video. The aim of this video is to show you some tips on how to write clean code. The first section of this video will be naming conventions for your variables. So I've seen a lot of people create variables like this, and this means nothing. And if you're writing variables like this, which are abbreviations or just a single letter, then they don't mean anything to anyone reading the code. And the idea is that hopefully the person reading the code will be able to understand what is happening in the code without needing any additional comments or any other additional information. So if you're writing any variable names or class names or function names, please make sure you create names that make sense. Stuff like first name, so that someone knows that this string is the first name of a user. And obviously, if you're working in C#, then you should be using the var keyword and then instantiating the variable. This will automatically make it into a string. This saves a bit of typing, and the person reading the code, if they understand C#, they will automatically see that this is a string and understand that this is a string, and vice versa for any other variable types like integer. So yeah, make sure your variable names or class names or function names are understandable and readable to anyone who might be looking at this code in the future. Now, the second thing that we're going to look at is magic numbers. So magic numbers essentially instantiating variables in certain places. Have seen a lot of new and junior developers do something like this, where they have a load of variable names at the start of their class. So and then and then a load of other stuff. So for example, so let's say we have this, for example, and you instantiate all your variables at the start, and then you have some code that is being written here that maybe checks if for example, first name is not empty, then do something. And then, there's maybe some more code here. And then at the very bottom here, for example, you will see another if here that's called, for example, if age is greater than 17, then, it can do something else. It doesn't really matter what goes inside these ifs. But as you can see here, this variable age is declared up here, but only first used down here. So if this method is quite long, then you will you end up reading a lot of code before actually reading this code here. So it can get a little bit confusing for anyone new to the code base who might not be as familiar with this particular method or area of this program. And you're essentially describing something at the very start before actually using it, which, you know, for a start might have some performance implications depending on what you're doing in the rest of the code. But also it's a little bit weird. Why would you declare it here if you're not going to be using it down here? So that if you're declaring any variables, this is giving me an error because of all these full stops. But if you're going to be using a variable, instantiate it just before you actually decide to use it. It will make it a lot easier to read and understand the code. So that's magic numbers. The reason why they're called magic numbers is because, you know, they magically appear in further down the method or code without actually being used. Now the next bit that we're going to be looking at is nested if conditions. Now I see a lot of this as well with junior and new programmers. They tend to have, for example, again we'll use our example of first name and surname, and for example, you know, this is a very simplified example, but you can end up with a situation like this, where if there's no white space, first name, but then, you know, if the first name isn't filled in, then, you know, they'll then check again if the surname isn't empty. Now this is a very simplified example. I don't actually think anyone would actually do this. However, you know, you can come up with a situation. For example, if you have a user roles, for example. So let's say, actually let's do this. So I don't think anyone will do this, but in case you are doing this, please put any logic like this on the same if statement. So something like this to check for both, to see if both of these names are filled in. However, let's say if we have, var role, for example, and let's assume that role 2 is an administrator, then we can check if role equals 2. So I'll see this in a lot of places. So for example, they check what the user's role is, let's say administrator, or, you know, whatever role they need to be, and then they do the other check that they want to do. Now, the reason why this is bad is because you start to have a lot of nested ifs, and you end up getting a lot of nested logic, which makes it extremely difficult to unit test your method. It also can have performance implications, and it's quite frankly difficult to read. Now, in this kind of situation, what I would recommend doing is, if you have a piece of logic that you need to check for, and basically the rest of the method won't actually work without that if statement being true, then what you need to do is take out your if statement from there, put the nested if statement further down, and inside the first if statement you need to return out, because basically the rest of the method won't actually work if this isn't true. So always put your initial logic at the top of the method, which needs to be true in order for the rest of the method to work, and any other checks that you need to apply into they should be at the top of your method, because the rest of the method essentially won't work without that part of it being true. And obviously, put these further down if you need them further down, and so on. And you can start to see how this is a little bit easier to read. So if my role is 2, then sorry, let's change this. If my role isn't 2, then we will return out of this method, and then we check if the first name and surname are filled in, and then if they are, then we do some cool bit of code in there. And the last bit of clean code tips that I'll give you is about comments. Now, a lot of developers like to use a lot of comments, and I personally think they're very unnecessary. Comments should be reserved for one purpose only, and that is to describe very specific business logic that it basically explains why you wrote the code in the way that you have written it. So if you have written a bit of code that is not it's not what you would expect, or it doesn't comply with the rest of the programming standards on your project, then you should probably add some comments to explain that. However, comments such as these, where you can put something like setting role to 2, that comment is extremely pointless. I've seen it above lines, I've seen it next to lines. There's just no need for these type of comments, because if the person who's reading this code, if he can't understand that you are setting the role to 2 over here, then he probably doesn't know how to code in the language that you are coding in. So whenever you're writing code, always assume that the person who will be reading that code understands code and can read code. You don't need to explain to them every single thing you're doing. And, something like this, for example. There's no need for comments like these. The reason why it's bad to have comments like this is, let's say for some reason you decide to, you no longer want to check for the role 2, you want to check for the role 3, and you do this change just to quickly fix a bug that you accidentally mistyped 2 and you meant to type in 3. So you quickly want to push out a fix. And what happens if the person who's doing the fix forgets to update the comment? The comment then becomes outdated, and the comment is then saying something different to what's actually happening below it. That's bad because it confuses any new developers. It also makes it more difficult to maintain code bases, because if you have something like this, you're essentially writing 2 lines of code to do one thing. So something as simple as this, you have 2 lines of code, then you have another 2 lines of code for the if statement to explain the if statement, and there's just no need for it. So always only write comments if you really must, if you're writing something that's out of the ordinary for your particular code base, and any very specific business logics to help the developer identify why the logic was written in that particular way. So yeah, I hope these tips helped you in your code development writing, and I hope your code is more clean from here on out. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.